Dr. Janet Veer, and I designed this discussion for some to be a preview and for others to be a reminder of how liberal arts disciplines bring thought-provoking and well-reasoned explorations of a variety of topics and current events and controversies. And this year, we're going to be spotlighting the work of two of our own BCLA faculty. Um, One you'll be hearing from today, Eliza Rodriguez y Gibson, and on Monday, June 28th, yes, yay, we'll be hearing from Professor Ed Park, who is the chair um, of Asian American Studies, and he will be talking about building a coalition in politics, down payment for real power, Stacey Abrams, Asian Americans, and the long game for coalition politics. So these events can be found along with last year's events on the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts in Action website. You can find it via our regular website. And please feel free to register for Dr. Park's session on the 28th. But today we're excited and super excited. I just want to be casual, super excited to introduce Dr. Eliza Rodriguez y Gibson, professor and chair of Chicana Latino Latina Studies. Um, she is involved in a plethora of scholarly pursuits, including authoring books, um, editing other books, writing essays, and in general, publishing in a number of venues. And so I decided not to go into sort of the expanse of all of those, but I did want to highlight one in particular that I think relates to our conversation today, which is being co-author of a book called Funny Looking Humor, Queer Latina Latino Camp, and Ugly Betty. So I'm excited to introduce you. I'm looking forward to this conversation today. If you have questions, there'll be some time for clarification questions during our talk, but she will also entertain questions at the end. And if you have a question, please just raise your hand. So without further ado, please welcome our guest speaker, and I will turn it over to Elisa.
Hi, everybody. So I have a slideshow. So my name is Eliza Rodriguez y Gibson. I was expecting, I think, a little bit of a different audience. So I'm kind of, talking as if I'm speaking to prospective students or people who don't know me. But those of you that know me, maybe you haven't seen me talk in this particular context. A little bit just about me. This is, sort of, hybrid of who I am as a person and also professionally. I'm a first generation college student, daughter of a Mexican immigrant family. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. I'm really a border kid, and I work in Chicana and Latina literature and cultural studies. And, the part of the mission that is really addresses the whole person is really drives a lot of my work. So ethics, aesthetics, feelings, and ideas, all of it goes into my analysis, into my work in the classroom, in my writing. Some of the stuff that I've worked on, you know what, let me actually show this to you properly instead of in this outline. Why can't I, here we go, view. Slideshow. There we go. That's how it's supposed to look. So some of these are just book covers that are on my, expert file page because they were there. So yeah, I've done some editorial work. Humor in Latino Camp is the co-authored book where some of these ideas about humor and social critique were, sort of first developed in a kind of extensive way. And really today, I wanted to talk about race representation and Latinx studies. This is a little collage that I put together to go with the small written piece that I was invited to do for ASAP at the end of last summer. ASAP is the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present, and it's a really vibrant cultural studies journal that's really humanities based. So first, I wanted to define some terms. I want to really, today I'll really be talking about representational politics and intersectional analysis. So, I don't want to just read slides, but basically, when I'm talking about representational politics, it's a way of really thinking about both the representations themselves and how it's put together and disseminated. And discourse, these representations are the building blocks of discourse, which is a key term that I'll go into a little bit later, but basically discourse is all of the, sort of representational, linguistic and ideological ways that we communicate ideas and values, I guess. Intersectionality, of course, refers to those, to those intersections of primary identities that really organize our experience. And so race, class, gender, and sexuality are the primary categories because those are the ones that really structure the society that we live in. The analysis is really what I want to stress as intersectional. Everybody has an intersectional identity, but not everybody thinks about how we understand those intersections. So I really, when I say intersectionality, I'm really thinking about the frameworks that we use to talk about those representations. And then finally, the sort of the one big theoretical term that I use a lot as is disidentification. So on the one hand, it sounds exactly like identification, but with a twist. And if we think about identification as when you connect with a representation because you see yourself in it, disidentification is that, but with, like I said, a critical twist. So it's a process where you take a dominant representation that really calls to us, but is also hurtful. And we take it and kind of hollow it out and create a space for ourselves so we can kind of take it over, we can steal it back. And it's really an important idea for thinking about how minoritized subjects, those of us who are really at the margins, steal back those hurtful representations and transform them for our own benefit. So disidentification works, what is really, it's useful for thinking about is it's a strategy that does particular kind of work, and it creates both pleasure and humor in taking back, stealing back something that was used to hurt us. And it's also used to critique a harmful representation very often. And so here's an example that is a major example that I use in the book, Betty's Poncho, where, this is the perfect example of Latinx camp where we have a dominant stereotype, the sleepy Mexican, under the poncho, which is actually replicated on the poncho itself, right? And here we have Betty, who's this very eager, hopeful, hardworking, and she's wearing this ridiculous poncho to her first day at work at a high fashion magazine, right? So again, the joke is, yes, we are laughing at Betty, but we're also laughing at this ridiculous stereotype of a poncho, right? And so it's critiquing the stereotype using comedy, but Betty herself is not the stereotypical brunt of the joke. Okay. So discourse, just a quick recap here. So if we think about discourse, right, broadly speaking, as I said before, it refers to those systems of representation that really shape the production of knowledge. And what's important to remember about discourse is that it really shapes what we know and how we know it. So representation matters because it's the building blocks of dominant discourses, and therefore racial representation shapes how we understand race, for example. But that representation, that process is a lot more complex than a one-to-one, relationship between, the representation and reality. Humor, irony, all these other things come in and they complicate the deployment of those representations and how we receive them. Very quickly, for any of you who are new to the idea of Latinx studies, The X is about gender inclusivity because Spanish is a gendered language. And I use A, O, and X to acknowledge the fact that I don't think we are post-gender. I think that we are very much, gender remains a very important lens for analysis. And so using the A and the O and the X is about expansion rather than a kind of one size fits all. So that's broadly, why I use A, O, and X, and I'll just use the X sometimes just as a shorthand. So why I'm so interested in representation is really because of the way that it suggests possibilities, right? And so here we have, this is, I want to say, from season 2 of America Ferrera's role on Superstore, where she goes from being very hesitant about a strike to here, she's wearing a red shirt, standing on a table, calling for a boycott. Representations matter in my thinking because they help us to think through possibilities. I talk about popular culture as a way of thinking with these texts and thinking with these dominant representations and thinking about how we can take those dominant representations and make them work for and with our own interest beyond just being entertained. And the reason I really want to focus on America Ferrera is that I've been following her career almost accidentally, just because of the text that she has, sort of had been in and helped me think through some questions, say, around adaptation, body image, Chicana and Latina, and engagements with the mainstream. These 3 shows really are an example, or this film and these 2 shows really are an example of the kind of work that Ferrera has done across her career, and why I'm so interested in her work as both an actor and as a producer. So now I'm going into the part where I read to you for about 10 minutes. So, and this is a piece that I did as I was contributing to a dossier on humor last summer, and it really was a kind of moment where we just wanted to do something fun in the middle of the pandemic, writing something short and really considering like what is what function does humor have, not only as potential satire and critique, but also what does it why is it important, what does it do for us? So here's the little thing that I wrote. I heart America Ferrera. I've just slowly binged Superstore again, 1 episode a night to make it last. It's my comfort food TV, familiar, warm, comfortable pleasure. I don't have to disidentify. I don't have to yell at my TV. There's no need. I trust America, which is a funny sentence for me to write because there's no way that I trust the nation that misappropriates not only her name, but that of 3 continents. But back to America F. I trust her because I heart her, but why? Partly it's because of the politics of her work, and she says all the right things in public. And yes, her work offers intersectional critique, and that is simply just not a thing on national TV, on primetime TV, but also that's not why. I heart her because of the deeply felt pleasures of laughing with someone like me. She's the child of Latina and Latino immigrants. She's a Latina feminist and she works in the mainstream. If you've never seen anyone like yourself on TV, it's thrilling. And as we're threatened, remember I wrote this last October, as we're threatened with another 4 years of the current genocidal presidential administration, it's life-saving. I've been a fan of America since her first role as Anna in the film adaptation of Real Women Have Curves in 2002. She was 19. As it happens, it was released during my first semester on the tenure track. I was teaching a very fractious seminar on Chicana feminisms. Everyone in the seminar loved the movie, and it gave us a way back to each other. I loved the US adaptation of Ugly Betty, which ran from 2006 to 2010, so much that I co-wrote a book about it. I excitedly watched her first follow-up project, a web anthology microseries called Wigs, in which, like Betty and Amy on Superstore, her character flirts with non-monogamy. In the past few years, America Ferrera has joined the ranks of other Latinas who've moved behind the cameras, like Sofia Vergara, Eva Longoria, and Salma Hayek. Ferrera became a producer from the start of Superstore in 2015, and by 2017, she was not only executive producing the show, but her own series, Gentefied. 2017 was the web version, 2020 was the version that came out on Netflix. She's an executive producer for both. I rehearsed this partial resume not to prove my fandom, which I'd fail anyway, because I never wanted to see the Traveling Pants movies or any of the animated dragon movies either. But instead, I want to highlight the projects that reveal a larger pattern of cultural activism and advocacy driven by intersectional critique and Latina feminist politics, especially as Ferrera's career has developed. She's moved from acting to producing, directing, and executive producing. Immigration and career advancement show up as recurring themes in both of her network sitcoms, Ugly Betty and Superstore. It's like America said, louder for the kids at the back. Superstore is the rarest of sitcoms. It wears its politics lightly, even as it eviscerates corporate exploitation and draconian immigration policies. While the critique got sharper as the show continued, it also softened its sharp edges, developing its characters and their friendships with each other while staying funny. The writing is sharp, and the comic timing of its performance is perfection. As an ensemble comedy, Superstore depends on the relationships between the characters, their unlikely friendships and rivalries. It also offers us some relational models of understanding and equality. The intersectional critique that drives many of Superstore's storylines is baked into the very setup. It's an ensemble workplace sitcom centering on the employees of a big box store. Its blue color scheme and rivalry with Target reminds one of Walmart. The show's working class politics are shockingly explicit for a primetime show on network television. It even outdoes Roseanne back in its glory days. In the episode where Dina, Lauren Ash, the assistant manager, decides to become a surrogate for the store's manager, Glenn, played by Mark McKinney, she notes that what she'll be paid to carry the pregnancy is about the same as her yearly salary, around $20,000. The following season, Amy, played by Ferrera, is promoted to store manager because Glenn steps down to be with his new baby, who only exists because Dina needs the money and Glenn couldn't afford a legitimate surrogacy service. We see Amy doing a happy dance at her desk when she learns of her new salary, $109K plus benefits and perks. In reality, managers of similar big box stores easily make more than that. A quick web search reveals that Costco managers make on average $130K and Walmart managers pull in $175K. In true comedic fashion, Amy's salary is accidentally revealed to the entire store. Not really an accident, but she doesn't intend to do that. Her friends and former peers hand out particularly sharp barbs about her relative wealth. And then we learn that the warehouse manager makes far more than Amy does because of a clerical error. Of course, Amy's career opportunity is only brought to fruition through a series of flukes that include running down the regional manager in a golf course with a golf cart and then blackmailing her for her cocaine habit. While Amy is indeed competent and hardworking, she never would have gotten the job, quote unquote, fair and square, because she was never in the running for it. The combination of flukes, talent, and hard work also show up in Ugly Betty. She only gets her foot in the door of a New York fashion magazine because the owner of the publishing company wants to punish his son with an ugly assistant. The critique of the American dream offered in both of these comedies acknowledges the precarity of those opportunities, and success is tinged with survivor's guilt. From the time Amy is promoted to manager on Superstore, she's continually trying to make things better and save the jobs of her friends and coworkers. From the vantage point of 2020, the now outlawed affirmative action programs that work to open the doors of access from the 70s through the 90s look like a fluke in the USA. I heart America because of this sitcom articulation of career advancement illuminates my own professional success. I'm kidding. Not really. While brown-skinned, Ferrera could pass as racially ambiguous. But when given the choice, she insists on playing not only as Latina, but specifically as Honduran, an identity that she publicly claims. That identity, however, is articulated as relational and its legibility is distorted by stereotype, as in an episode where she's assigned to hand out salsa samples wearing a Mexican sombrero, and she's scolded for not putting on a more Latin accent. Privilege and precarity are intimately linked, as we see in Dina's surrogacy storyline. Amy's Latinidad on the show is articulated in relationship to her working class coworkers. And in an important pedagogical move, the topic of immigration shifts from Latina, Latino, Latinx communities to Asian American ones. Superstore's Mateo, played by Nico Santos, is not only undocumented, but also gay and Filipino, aspects of his identity that complicate his romance with Jeff, a white regional manager. The tension and fear underlying Mateo's status threads through 2 seasons, and it reaches an apex in an ICE raid that is the result of corporate's union busting efforts. It ends in Mateo's apprehension and arrest. The sight of what looks like a SWAT team chasing Amy and Mateo, navigated via headset and Dina's directions from the security cameras, is an uncomfortable combination of tragedy and farce, highlighting the militarized terrorism directed at ordinary working class people of color. I heart America because of this combination of tragedy and farce, resistance and negotiation that honestly animates my everyday. I'm the child of Mexican immigrants. I made it. I'm a tenured professor at a small private school where I'm pretty happy. Ferrera's work sits in the space where mine does, right in the mainstream, engaging serious forms of violence and inequality. Ferrera winces when she delivers lines that offer difficult truths, and she's famous for her TV star smile. I read somewhere that Lloyd's has insured it. I keep thinking, her comedies are so very like teaching undergrads. Smile, charm, show them you're human, make them laugh, and then hit them with the truth. This is trickster pedagogy. Truth enters laughing, and I'm here for it. Okay, I'm done. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. So do you want to entertain some questions now or some
Yes,
thoughts?
please.
Excellent.
I see a lot of colleagues in the room. Hello, colleagues. Hello, chums. Hello, students.
How many students do we have in the room? I see you, Dr. Drummond. 1 second. Are there students or alumni in the room?
Hi, Tammy.
All right, your fam. All right, Elizabeth, you want to ask your question?
Hi, thanks, Deanna, and thanks, Lisa, for the presentation. I also think America Ferrera is great, and I remember her in Real Women Have Curves, and it's one of those things where I find it a little irritating that she hasn't aged at all, or doesn't seem to have aged at all. My question is actually, I mean, your concept of, or the concept of disidentification, and I think it's a really interesting way to talk about these dynamics about sort of the seizing of stereotypes and the reappropriation of them. I guess my question is about how, and I also, in a very, very, very different context, historical and cultural, look at questions of representation and power and mobilization and things like that. But I wonder, one of the challenges is always about how do we shift from talking about the production of representations to the reception of representations? And with a concept like disidentification, that is really dependent on issues of reception. I'm wondering how you try and tackle that in some of your own work, and maybe with something that's so present in our popular culture, like Ugly Betty and Superstore. I mean, maybe that's a little bit easier in some ways than in others, but I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit about how you kind of get at those issues, because I find that the question of reception, or how the audience internalizes things who's receiving these representations, is always the really challenging one, right? I can say a lot, but I don't know if other people are understanding the representations in the way that I've interpreted them, or that how they were intended to be interpreted.
Yeah. So this is absolutely a disciplinary question, right? So that, I mean, honestly, disidentification comes from, okay, the first sort of major use in the way that I'm talking about it really comes from Jose Esteban Muñoz's book, 1999. Was it 99? Maybe it was 99. Yeah. Book Disidentifications, Queers of Color and Performance. And in that, he's really looking at quite the not mainstream engagements, but very, very small performance art, you know, things that really have been witnessed by maybe 15 people in all of history. And in the way that he writes about it, in the way that, you know, this is solidly sort of situated in queer theory and in queer models of sort of cultural production and circulation and world building, right? And in the way that my co-author and I have written about it vis-a-vis Ugly Betty, media studies is a discipline that really is all about audience reception, right? And so if you look at media studies as media studies, there's all kinds of, those are reception studies, and they go in and they look at fan, discussion boards and the surveys and all that stuff. And writing the book from not in a media studies discipline, but really as cultural studies scholars, which is what the difference there really is, that we read everything as text, right? And so the interest there is really in the way that the discourse is articulated and the way that it circulates, and all of the multiple possibilities. And the question of how it lands or not is in some ways not like other people are doing that. And so I'm really interested in, how do these things circulate? What are the possibilities? And this is why humor ends up being a really important part of it, because you can never predict if a joke is going to land, right? You can never predict, are they going to get the joke? Are they going to not get that I'm joking? Well, I guess, oh well. And so you have to judge the success of the joke, right, on was it funny or not. So there's always the risk, right, that no one's going to get it, that they'll take you literally instead of ironically, or what have you. But what I find, like for me, the reason it matters the most is because it's another layer of interpretation, right? And so meaning is this kind of palimpsestic thing where it's layers and layers and layers and layers. And so any one particular reception is less important than kind of looking at the way all of it kind of comes together, and all the possible ways that it gets read, if that makes sense.
So what's coming to mind for me is really thinking about sort of what this looks like in terms of well-being for people to be able to see themselves in these representations. I'm thinking about like the comedic. I mean, what keeps coming to mind, which is like a different set of representations, was like what the Cosby Show meant to African Americans. When was that? The 80s, 90s? I can't remember.
Yeah, it was the 80s. It was the 80s. Yeah.
Just regarding all that's come up more recently about folks in it, but
can we though?
we can think about the representation of that, followed by a different world, followed by girlfriends is another one in between, living single, but just what that meant for folks to be able to have people, and I am thinking about the fact that they were all comedies, to be able to sort of see yourself and see your experiences, and what that meant for your own sense of like, wow, people really do exist, and we can tell different stories. right, than what we often
Yeah.
see.
Yeah. And I also think that there is, I think genre matters. I think that in any genre that is supposedly, you know, realist and therefore universal, it's still really like that's not where you see people of color. I find more representation happening, and if we're talking about mainstream representations, more racially diverse, sexually diverse, gender diverse representations. I see them in non-realist genres, in science fiction, fantasy, comedy, but almost never in a straight drama, right? In a sort of conventional realist drama, the protagonists are still um, primarily white, unless it is a, you know, sort of historically significant drama, right? Unless it's, you know, sort of a you know, civil rights historical drama, then you get Black people at the center. Or if it's like, you know, the Chicano walkouts, then you get a drama that's like about Chicanos at the center. But if it's just sort of generic, you know, kind of regular family drama, it's still gonna be white people. And I, you know, that so for me, I'm really deeply invested in these kind of non-realist genres on television and in popular culture, because that's where we show up. And I think it has something to do with realism, you know, sort of the conventions of realism and universality, right? Um, so I end up watching a lot of comedy and non-realist stuff, because that's where you see the non-normative subject.
So I don't know if I should read this whole thing. I guess everybody has it, but Robin, hi Robin. For what it's worth, there's an emerging field in comedy studies or something like that. Sarah Emanuel, who does ancient biblical studies, has some work in this area.
Yeah.
And there's interesting older area
Yeah.
of media studies that uses gratifications research. You're gonna respond to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's incredible possibilities in comedy, and humor studies is a whole other discipline that I just, you know, kind of borrowed a little bit of. Methodologically, I am very promiscuous. I am all over the map. I mean, my training is all in sort of poetics and literary theory, and then, you know, I finished my degrees and started writing about film and adaptations and TV and comedy. So for me, really, there's this kind of central concern with um, what do we do with those representations, and, you know, what are all the possibilities, and how we, you know, so sometimes it's with humor, sometimes it's horror, sometimes it's apocalyptic. You know, the registers of all of those things. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is that work that sort of, I don't know, has a really big affective punch, um, that really, you know, sort of eschews the realist and the sort of very subtle. I'm really drawn to texts that are just like over the top and anti-realist in a lot of ways, just because I think there's more possibility there. I mean, it's also why I write about poetry rather than narrative. Again, in the non-figurative, I find a lot of possibility. What are you all watching and why?
Good question.
Why did you guys want to come see me talk, and not just because you're my friends? What did you want to talk about? What are you watching?
Okay, see you all get warmed up. I'm like, the other thing keeps coming to mind for me is you're thinking about is like Shonda Rhimes' work. So why I'm
Yeah.
blanking on the show that was my
Bridgerton.
Bridgerton. That was my
Bridgerton.
my winter fantasy show, right? But you know, her explorations of looking at how you represent people and spaces and places has been really, really interesting over time. But Bridgerton being one in particular, which was both some realism that we actually didn't realize was real, right? Some historical context that was more accurate than we want to admit, and then some that was really quite inaccurate.
Yeah. Bridgerton was a fascinating bonbon. It was like this sort of perfect little candy that you knew, it's not good for you. You can't live off of it. There's some parts of it that are actually really bad for you if that's all you eat, but it was fun. Jennifer, black-led comedy or black-led horror. What are you thinking of in particular? Are you still here?
Hey, sorry, Ember's doing things. I watched them recently.
Oh, how was that?
Well, everyone is calling it trauma porn, and that's been an interesting conversation.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
Yeah, but otherwise, like, it's kind of hard to do stuff like as like a viewer, an observer of media, and of a critic of media at the same time. And so I'm watching it and I'm like, I can use that as an academic text for my students. It'd be so great. But then on the flip side, it's also like, I can see the trauma of watching Black characters going through the same horrible experiences. And, what does that do to an audience member?
Yeah. The representation of that. I mean, I think this is also why, like, I find the speculative really powerful, because, so say for example, the Star Trek Discovery. Anybody watching it? The latest Star Trek show? Yeah, there's like in season 1, there's all this stuff, right? Where, and I'm not sure that they get it right, but there are interesting conversations, right, about sort of cultural nationalism and purity, and then sort of the melting pot of the Federation and the kind of militaristic stuff, and I think that Jennifer, to your point about you texts that re-traumatize, there's still that kind of racialized violence, but it's not in the context that we recognize, but there are those things that we recognize. So there's like a fair bit of translation, and but yeah, I mean, you could use it to map onto all the same questions about race and nation, and sort of historical whitewashing jobs, right? But yeah, no, it and the question of like what text do we use for teaching and how we make those decisions, they're important, right? Because you're like, well, I mean, for example, like the text that I used this last year in my sort of intro to cultural studies and doing this stuff, I made sure we looked at things that were not traumatizing, because there's enough trauma out in the world. So I was like, yeah, let's watch Vida, and we'll watch Hustlers, and we'll watch Spider-Man. And we're going to talk about race and representation and gender and sexuality and gentrification and all of these things, but we're not going to traumatize you with our texts. And I think about that all the time, especially if we're talking about those representations of violence and inequality. Because ultimately, I mean, I think what we're trying to do when we teach this material, we're just trying to teach them habits of mind, right? Critical frameworks, habits of questioning, right? Rather than the particulars of that given text.
Ways of seeing, right? I'm just going back to
John Berger. Yep, all of that.
Well, I was gonna say, so I love both shows, Superstore and Ugly Betty. Those were like 2 of my favorite for the exact reasons that you talked about, right? That there aren't very many Latinas in media. And so when you do find the Latina in media, we tend to gravitate toward it. But
my God, let me see it. Yeah.
Exactly. But I do always have the concern that then it's just going to lead to a whole set of stereotypes. And then I'm going to be having to fight against those stereotypes, right? And saying that we're not spicy, like we're not, challenging, we're not this and this and this. And so, and not everyone that's Latina is middle class or working class or these kinds of things. So I think that's always like, I like it, obviously I like the shows and I like that that America Ferrera has gone so far, but it's always my worry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one really interesting thing to me about both Ugly Betty and Superstore is that there's this like class ascendancy narrative, right? Like she starts out at the bottom and then ends up, sort of like leaving to go do great things. And yet, right, there's also the parallel critique to that sort of American dream narrative, right? Because everything is like, if things had not been lined up exactly the way they are, right? It's sort of opportunity, farce, tragedy, circumstance, it's all of it. And I mean, I think it really does get to that precarious, even like Janet, what you're saying right now about like just being able to enjoy those representations, like it's a precarious experience. You don't know what you're gonna get, right? You're like, oh no, is this gonna be like a terrible Saturday Night Live skit, or is this going to be something we haven't seen before, right?
I'm going to keep jumping in because I mean the other thing that just keeps coming to mind for me is that we keep having these challenges and things that we latch onto because, like Chimamanda Adichie said, we have the challenge of the single story, right? So we keep seeing those same stories, and until we have enough to latch onto,
well, right,
we
and
have
that's
what Janet is saying, this sort of fear of, okay, do I have to
that's right.
now address
And we need
this?
there's so few Latinx shows. Like we need every show to be so good. Like we don't have, like there's no critical mass of Latinx media in the way that we have a critical mass, thankfully, of, I think, African American media. And so there can be shitty Black comedies and nobody cares. Meanwhile, if there's like a shitty Latino comedy, it's like, nope, everybody hated Cristela. You can never have a sitcom again. I'm like, no, but it was one show, right? And this is why I think this is also, I think, why I've been paying attention to Ferrera and Hayek and everybody else who like moves into producing, right? Even Jennifer Lopez has moved into producing. I mean, the production, that this is where the industry changes, right? This is where those opportunities arise. Jennifer, your hand's up. Jump in, please.
Yeah, actually on that, because it's like we're doing the difference between let's say mainstream and kind of like streaming content now as well. And I'm thinking
Yeah, that's
about
the other part.
One Day at a Time and other kind of shows. And like
Right.
they're also being kind of like thrown to the Hulus and the Netflix, which as much as they do have like popularity, it's also they're not as much marketed as well.
That's
And
right.
so can you
That's
say
right.
more on that maybe?
Yeah, I mean, other than noticing, yeah, so where do we find Latinx programming? It's on these minor streaming services, right? Like Stars or Pop TV or something like that. I mean, they're not even, because I would say like what are the big streaming networks are what? Hulu and Netflix and Amazon Prime, and everything else is like, they're like smaller, if we're going to make a kind of comparison to prime time and then smaller cable networks. Yeah, I mean, it's because we're not seen as commercially viable, right? Like HBO is not giving us, we're not getting picked up by HBO, we're getting picked up by Pop TV. Do you have thoughts about that, Jen?
I think I'm also like reflecting on your comment about like bad African American shows.
That was me, sorry.
No, it's
but
okay.
I mean, there's no critical mass of Latinx programming. Like right after Ugly Betty, the next best thing we had was like some terrible show with Rob Schneider, where I was like, are you kidding me? That's the follow-up? And it was absolutely, I mean, it was terrible. It was so offensive and so like just run by stereotypes. Yeah, like I'm like, where's, I mean, the other thing is that I also think that Hollywood has a very small tolerance for quote unquote diversity, right? Like we can only have Shonda Rhimes. There can't be more than one woman of color kind of powerhouse showrunner. I mean, Gloria Calderon Kellett is, doing things, but again, like, you know, shoved over to Pop TV. Yeah, Mandalorian. I did see the Mandalorian. And yeah, let me see. Critical mass, meaningful variety. Yeah, all of these things. Yeah, absolutely, Michaela. Yeah, I mean, these are all like media studies questions that are about like the industry that I know less about, right? Mandalorian, yeah. Although I gotta say, what, like, yeah, okay, but his Latinidad is incidental, right? I mean, you know, Pedro, what's his name? I forget his name. You know, we're like, yay, Latino-led show, but he's covered up and not really allowed to be there. I mean, I don't know. It's a rough, it's a terrible terrain. I mean, I remember being invited by like the vice president of diversity, whatever, at Disney to talk about the book. And he wanted to ask me and my co-author, how come nobody's watching Ugly Betty, and how do we get them to watch more? And we were like, that's not the work we do. The work we do is about the text itself, not like how to get you viewers and how viewers, you know, connect to TV or not. I'm like, just write good stuff and we'll watch. But you know, that's not, of course, what the VP of diversity wanted out of me. So thanks everybody for coming and for your comments. I mean, Michaela, I would love to talk to you more about, you know, some of the frameworks that you're talking about, you know, sort of scripting theories. I'm not familiar with the phrase scripting theories, but yeah, the effects of media and the variety of representation. Michaela, did you want to say more about scripting theories? Okay. Well,
Oh,
I'm so sorry. Well, thanks everybody for coming and talking. This was fun.
yeah, and thank you, Elisa, for coming and leading this dialogue. So, and being being a part of this year's discussion, but giving us something to think about and a way to reframe and rethink about sort of what we're watching and how we can use them in our own work. So we appreciate you. Thank you for taking this time. I also want to acknowledge Katie Harper and Allison Mullen for supporting this work today. I always want to give them credit for helping us deal with the uh, um, announcements and technology for this work. But so glad y'all are here. So glad that we get to have these conversations and that we get to hear from each other. And frankly, that we get to see each other every once in a while. So until we get back to campus, we will see you soon. And thank you for joining us, everyone. And thank you for your talk.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.